And since we're talking about sex-based differences, no, actually, first I want to talk about something else. I thought I could make an elegant segue, but no, it's not going to happen. So I'm just going to move on to another topic that I'm really interested in, which is muscle growth potential over the short and the long term, which is something that you covered in your paper as well. So if we're talking about people who are not going to use steroids, Derek, what is your take on our ability to put on muscle over a lifetime of lifting, and also your thoughts on obviously the research that you're going to speak about and the limitations of this research? So because I think that's going to be important to cover.
Yeah, so I think I'll start by saying I think most people respond to resistance training. And so what I mean by this is I have a hard time accepting that there are no um, that there are non-responders essentially. And so um, it's just some people need more volume or more of a stimulus. They don't grow as much, but there is some adaptations that come from picking up a weight. So I'll start by saying that uh, if you call yourself a quote unquote hard gainer, I don't know if that's fair. There just may be something you could try in your training that would promote growth. And again, it could be more volume. It could be, again, we talked about the variety of loading schemes. It could be BFR, etc. There's a lot of avenues we could go down. But I think I'll start with saying, like, we kind of modeled, the years 0 to 5 of resistance training, and certainly, unfortunately for us, it is asymptotic. So we do have like I don't know, a physiological genetic cap, unfortunately, or we'd all be Superman, right? And so I will acknowledge that, but also address for those that are, like myself, natural bodybuilders that are trying to push how much juice can I squeeze, right? Most people aren't going to get there. And so that's the reality. There's so many factors of why you may not. But essentially, what it boils down to is like life factors, right? Like, so again, my wife and I, we've had 2 kids. I'm finishing a PhD, so sleep isn't great. So right there, right, there's a hole in the genetic potential because I'm not getting that sweet 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Oh, I miss those days. But inevitably, there it is, right? So I can't say I'm going to be at my genetic ceiling when in fact I haven't looked at that's the reality. So circling back to this, I think what it is essentially there is a maximal stimulus that's required to continue to create and promote adaptations that has to be achieved and be able to recover from. And so, and this is one of, I really like Dr. Mike's like landmarks for that, right? You have the minimum adaptive volume and the maximum recover volume. And eventually, as you approach a ceiling, those basically are the same, right? The most you can do to adapt is the most, the minimum you need to adapt, right? That's, is the most you can recover from. And that's kind of where you're at, right? And so I think most people won't get there for, again, a number of reasons. But that said, you can gain significant amount of muscle mass from resistance training, or we fat-free mass based off our literature and the DEXA data and everything. So with that in mind, there's a couple things we modeled the growth curve, if you will, in our review, and I think one of the things, gains are fairly modest, right? So if you are doing nothing and start doing something, we're going to see, somewhere around 1 to 2 kilograms of fat-free mass. That can be, on the lower end, we have bottom 10% responders. You might see an increase of like, I think it was like 0.4 kilos. On the higher end, it was we've seen over gains in fat-free mass of over 5.5 kilos, right? And so, um, on average, high responders, you'll see, anywhere from, 3 kgs to upwards of close to 4 kilograms. Now, I want to mention that this uh, is, fat-free mass. And so that's important as well. This is, we model these gains in fat-free mass. That's not entirely muscle, right? So it's composed of muscle, of course, but your organs, water, etc. So some of that can be water, particularly in that short of a time. But again, the largest driver longitudinally in growth is going to be muscle, of course. Now, the look at somebody's lifting career. If we look at the fat-free mass index of natural bodybuilders, it's somewhere, on average, somewhere between 22 and 25 kilograms of, fat-free mass index, which is essentially fat-free mass divided by their height in meters squared. It's rare for folks that are natural to get above a fat-free mass index of 25. That's not to say it isn't plausible. Again, that's just what that data suggests. Now, we also took some of the inspiration from Dr. Eric Trexler's article in Mass that we referenced as well, because it's a great discussion on this topic as well. And he did some work with some college football players. They had a huge fat-free mass index. But again, I think it's important to, you got to parse out that DEXA data. DEXA measuring fat-free mass. We talk about that again. Water, the larger the person, the more body water they're going to store, etc. When we look at that to females, again, the relative gains are achievable, but again, as we mentioned, females on average are smaller. So we think a reasonable estimation is about 70% of those observed, but nobody actually really knows that, right? So that's important. This is a conversation. In this paper, it's a narrative review. It's not an RCT. We didn't have these folks train for 5 years and model their growth. This is just based off our sense of the literature. And so, I think the biggest thing is, right, the biggest gains, you start lifting, you're going to have a robust increase, quite quickly. Gains 0 to years 1 is going to be very robust. And then over time, that's going to flatten out. I think the other thing I wanted to add, and we talked about that in the paper as well, is this isn't meant to discourage folks like ourselves and your listeners and the audience that, wants to achieve that, upper genetic ceiling. This isn't to say, oh, you're never going to put any muscle on. It's twofold. One is we kind of say this is a slow process. And so we want to view it in the lens of months and years and not days and weeks, right? And that's one of the constraints that we have another figure in the review in the literature is most of our training studies are limited to like a semester's duration. So, 12 weeks, you're lucky to get 16 weeks or beyond, to be completely honest. My colleague and I did a 3 menstrual cycle study, and it took us 2.5 years to get it done. Take that how you want to approach it. But the other factor is it's meant to show people like, hey, if you're not doing anything, you can make a substantial amount of progress by just starting and being consistent, right? And I think that's the biggest driver. It's like, get off the couch and you can make some, robust gains, and particularly very fast early on. Take advantage of those newbie gains, if you will, because, that's ultimately where the majority of your gains over your lifetime are going to be anyway, right? And then, of course, we go on to talk about the myriad of health benefits from resistance training as well. So whether or not you reach your genetic ceiling, there's a ton of benefits from lifting weights, independent of muscle growth. And so that's an important factor to acknowledge.
I really liked your take on these data in the paper because, for one, some people might be held back by the thought that they have hit their genetic ceiling. But based on this data, it's very unlikely that you're going to. So, why limit yourself that way, thinking, what's the point of continuing to train? I've hit my genetic ceiling. Much more likely, it's much more likely that short-term growth has slowed to a point that for you it's undetectable, and you need to start making comparisons on a longer time frame than you might like because of the asymptotic nature of the gains, meaning there are diminishing returns, vastly diminishing returns, unfortunately, the more
Yeah,
experienced that
yeah,
you
for
are.
sure. Yeah, and I mean, for most people, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and that's okay. But I think to call it a genetic ceiling is probably uh, irresponsible, or incorrect, because it's not your genetics. In fact, lifestyle, um, more than likely, right? Like, again, we all have other obligations. For most of us, it's a hobby. If you're a pro natural bodybuilder, listening to this, maybe you make 3 or sometimes four figures once every few years, right? Competing, right? We do it because we love it, not because of the funds that in most cases. Like, I'm not a pro yet. Shout out Dan Cole from Natty News Daily, who beat me for that pro card. But, Danny's not making a living as a natural pro, right? So we do it because we love it. So um, yeah, again, for most people, juice not worth the squeeze. But most people, you're going to make a substantial amount of gains in your first, 6 months to a year. Just get after it. And yeah, somewhere from 3 pounds or 1.5 kilos on average in 12 weeks of fat-free mass is kind of awesome, right? Um, and again, that's for males, but the point stands.
And it, I think it's also important to think of these data as helpful to gain perspective. I like that at no point in the paper you said we should start quantifying your potential for gains to the gram, because you stated in the paper that there are so many limitations to this research that the numbers are what the data can give you, but they're not necessarily perfect. And I think that also, it's important not to try to quantify how many kilograms or pounds of muscle you could gain, because depending on your size, this is going to translate differently to your appearance and to the value that that muscle can add to your quality of life. Meaning, if you are a smaller person, gaining 3 kilograms is going to make you look likely bigger than somebody who is taller and just a bigger person. Think about 3 kilograms of muscle spread across a body. So, thinking about it in
Absolutely.
numbers doesn't really matter that much when we gain muscle to make our body look different and for our quality of life to improve because we have more physical independence thanks to the extra muscle mass. And if we can make so many gains just by going from untrained to beginners, then I would think that it's very valuable to get at least those gains because they can already make a substantial change to both your physique and your quality of life.
Yeah, and I think there's some utility to some of the body composition measurements that we use in research, like DEXA and ultrasound, etc. But there's a lot of limitations, particularly tracking individual change. We use it again for group level change, but you know the the biggest thing is for folks is like you don't have particularly for those like physique athletes and things like that, we don't have those on stage with us, right? Like you don't walk up and go, oh, like you're 7% on DEXA, you're 8%, so you win, right? We have visuals and how you look. And so that's so important, I think, for that aspect, but also like the general population. Like I've had I'm thinking of this guy. I did actually a DEXA scan with a bodybuilder not too long ago. Where he was like, I just got to get down to 10%, and I was like, well, like, you be happy with like how you look at 10%? He's like, oh, I just like, he at the time he was, trying to get ready for contest prep, but I was like, are you going to be satisfied if you hit 10%? Like, and that stands for the general pop as well. Like, okay, what happens if you're 11 and you're happy with how you look? Are you really going to let this arbitrary number influence like how you feel about yourself? No, right? Like, yeah, I think that's again, there can be some good data from it longitudinally in tracking things, but yeah, let's focus on the big picture here.
I agree. And ultimately, as valuable as these measuring tools can be in research, they are not easily available to the general population. So even if they were perfectly accurate, what does it matter if you're not going to want to spend the money on an ultrasound or a DEXA scan? And if somebody has a goal of getting to 10%, my question would be, so if I told you that you were 10% right now, would you be happy? And if the answer, whether the answer is yes or no, doesn't matter, because clearly that shows that what you're basing the answer on is the way that you look. Because if I told you you're 10% right now, so mission accomplished. You looked in the mirror and went, but I still want more muscle and to look leaner. Well, clearly 10% was never the goal, was it? And
Yes,
likely,
exactly.
similarly, if the answer is yes, it's because you're looking in the mirror and you're thinking, yes, 10% is where I've got the amount of muscle that I want and the amount of fat that I prefer. So clearly, again, the goal was never the number. It was how you feel and how you look.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree.
Derek, I am conscious of the fact that we've gone on for 35 minutes longer than originally expected. Would be able to go on until your 12 p.m., but I want to be respectful of your time. Is that good with you or no?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm happy to chat. Like I said, I finished up data collection for the semester, so I'm happy to chat. I got some time today.
Brilliant. So let's move on to the next topic that I want to cover from that paper. And this is about hormones. There has been a lot of chat about the importance of hormones when it comes to muscle hypertrophy. And we're talking specifically about hormones like testosterone, growth hormone, and IGF-1, insulin like growth factor 1. These seem to go up for a brief period of time after a training session. And some people have for a long time believed that this would improve hypertrophy or lead to hypertrophy. I'm wondering what the research that we have now suggests and what you think about that.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, right? So you got testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, growth factor one. Um, these have been kind of hypothesized as these internal variables that have a causative role with hypertrophy. Um, so first, full stop. Let's distinguish endogenous versus exogenous use. So endogenous, normal fluctuations in your systemic hormones from a day to day, chronically speaking, right? Versus exogenous anabolic steroids. We know those are going to stimulate growth. It's a whole other mechanism that we can get into if you'd like, but those are, yeah, they're that's not we're not arguing that. Um, but what we are showing is the direct investigations of that thesis, and essentially those acute um, changes in the anabolic hormones. There's really no support for them underpinning neither muscle hypertrophy or like muscle protein synthesis. So even like the acute signaling aspect. So this is work that was done in my lab with Stu before I got there. So I have to acknowledge that this isn't my research, but those before me. So great work from researchers like Sarah Wilkinson Dan West, who really, interrogated this in depth. So, um, Sarah did a study. There was 10 males. They basically did legs uh, or like a unilateral model for 10 weeks, or 8 weeks, excuse me. That study was 8 weeks. Nonetheless, what they found was trying to promote this increase in free test, total test, growth hormone, insulin growth factor 1, uh, cortisol is another as well. We should mention, um, and essentially um, the increases in hypertrophy only was in the train leg. So what that is getting at is their hypertrophy limb specific. The leg that didn't train isn't going to grow. And so some may be like, well, the exogenous or sorry, the endogenous hormone fluctuation may be like synergistic additive effect to that contraction. But again, these are systemic circulating hormones, so that kind of squashes that argument. So, you know, and then we have work from Dan West, who also has a really great paper called "Muscle is an Intrinsic, Muscle Hypertrophy is an Intrinsic Process." But that's another great paper. But essentially, he took the same idea, looking at the unilateral model, where essentially they had folks do like legs before like bicep curls, and so essentially what the idea was, they were trying to get this rise in those hormones, um, and really look at MPS with that. And so again, the study itself was one arm training under the following a leg session to get the elevations in testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1, and so the um, the other exercise just trained the arm. So basically, the one arm trained, then the other arm followed intense following an intense leg workout. Excuse me, and then again the other leg or other arm, excuse me, came in on a separate day. And again, the no differences in growth. So essentially, both conditions had similar increases in muscle, both CSA and strength gains. And then, so some folks say, well, that's, acute, and we have to look at things more chronically. So Dan and Stu did a quite a large study, so 56 men, and they found essentially no associations. Again, none of the rises in hormones correlated with gains in lean body mass, nor leg press like strength gains. So it just really highlights, that the transient hormonal fluctuations are not like we don't see any correlation with hypertrophy nor strength. And I think the biggest thing, and we already kind of talked about this, right? But we acknowledge that in the paper, right? If systemic hormone concentrations were primary regulators of hypertrophy, then we should see sex-based differences, right? Females have 10 to 20 fold lower testosterone, and upwards to like 200-fold lower free test, right? And again, we don't see any differences in muscle protein synthesis following males and females. And that, again, I'm waiting for some other evidence to suggest why hormones systemically would contribute. Again, I could continue if you'd like. Like, I'm thinking, the work that we're doing now. So Rob Morton and Sarah Oikawa did a study with trained males, higher versus lower load, and took blood measurements, and neither the load nor hormones influenced the resistance training adaptation. The things have really I guess what is old is new again, and so that's kind of where that hormone aspect came from. That work, but now has been extrapolated to females, right? And so I won't, say that person specifically, but there's like a famous saying that females aren't small men, um, or women aren't small men, and while that's true, they have their own unique physiology and considerations, and of course, that's important. Um, they are still human, and so we have to acknowledge that. Um, just because in some cases there's females are underrepresented in the exercise physiology research, that's I'm trying to change, be a part of that change. That doesn't make it acceptable, in my opinion, to extrapolate rodent studies where they're overectomized and removed completely of estrogen uh, to females, going through menopause where it's a slow decline, um, to um, to basically infer that estrogen has this anabolic effect. Um, we kind of discuss that um, in our paper because it's also too, and it's notable that post-menopause females can gain relatively similar amounts of muscle to age match men that have went through andropause. So that right there, acute hormonal rises do not affect protein turnover or signaling, um, and thus hypertrophy. Um, and then again, so work from our lab now, we've kind of done this work with females. Dr. Lauren Colenso Semple just she finished her PhD up looking at menstrual cycle phase and its effects on and as well as oral contraceptive and its effects on muscle protein synthesis and breakdown and no difference of phase. We took it a step further. My colleague Alicia D'Souza and I, we performed a chronic training study over 3 menstrual cycles, employing a unilateral model, and again, no difference in menstrual cycle phase. So stay tuned for that data, will or that paper that will be out hopefully over the next few months as we've got that kind of written up. But all that to say is, um, yeah, the females again, they do have their own unique physiology, of course, right? Menstrual cycle as males without the lived experience, I would never tell somebody to not take a day off if menstrual cycle symptoms affect performance, etc. But that's not the same as acknowledging that the chronic rise in reproductive hormones do not influence protein synthesis or muscle hypertrophy or strength for that matter. So, yeah, all that together is essentially we put in our review, a conceptual model where the external inputs or external variables, i.e., resistance training, right? So lifting, contracting the musculature, um, basically interacts with those internal processes. So we have, the mechanotransduction, mTOR signaling, and all those other factors. But we uh, basically subtract the changes in systemic hormonal fluctuations and the cellular swelling that we discussed already because of the lack of evidence.
Brilliant, super exhaustive, Derek. And the summary is we don't worry about hormones when we're trying to design a training program or executing it, is what I'm understanding, at least within normal physiological ranges. Of course, as you say here at the beginning, if you're taking testosterone exogenously as part of your PED protocol or performance enhancing drug protocol, of course, you're going to build more muscle. It's the whole point. But then now we're going beyond normal physiological range.
Yeah, yeah. And so, like, again, that's another conversation, a different mechanism, but for us, natural mere mortals, yeah, the influence of or hormone, in my opinion, I'm not convinced. And again, I think the the males versus females both achieving hypertrophy basically answers that right there, right? I think that enough said. Mic drop. Right?
The only thing I'm thinking about is that there seems to be an increase in muscle mass in males associated with the onset of puberty, and people usually associate that with the sudden increase in testosterone. And that's why males start with more muscle at baseline, because they have more muscle, they develop more muscle as they go through puberty. So that is the only time that I am aware of when having a certain hormonal level seems to be associated with muscle growth, and it doesn't seem to reoccur based on the data that we have. So then I'm thinking potentially if you start with insufficient hormonal levels, so we're not within normal physiological range, we're below normal physiological range, because a child, whether male or female, would not have normal physiological adult range level testosterone. So if we start from inadequate hormonal levels and we go through to normal hormonal levels, that could cause an increase in muscle mass that we weren't able to achieve before. And I think there is some research in men who have inadequate testosterone levels who then restore them within normal physiological ranges that potentially supports that idea. But I don't know enough about it. I am speculating right now based because I don't know enough about the research on the topic.
Yeah, no, that's again a good point. But that again comes from like you know being deficient in something that is regulating um like processes, and so it's like saying like sometimes more is not better, right? But if we're deficient in something, like, right, if if you don't have vitamin C, we get scurvy. But if we take 100 tablets of vitamin C, it's not going to um you know stop us, like, what I mean? It's not going to lead to a greater effect of protecting against scurvy. It's just not being deficient in that vitamin, right? So I think that's probably um, like that's my thought process where I go to is like, okay, if you're deficient uh, in your hormones, there's probably other biological processes that we're deficient in, and so like if we bring it up to sufficient levels, yeah, we're probably going to see muscle growth, because ultimately, like, muscle building is a um, energy demanding process. And so if we're lacking testosterone or other, anabolic hormones or anything, right, the body's going to work on the you know, reproductive system first as opposed to muscle building, right? And that's important. Like, as a bodybuilder in contest prep, when you have low testosterone, low libido, I don't think your body's concerned with putting muscle tissue on, right? So that's as somebody who's been through prep, it's not about making gains; it's about holding on to as much as you can, right? So that's where I'm thinking, like, as somebody who went through prep and uh, had probably lower than normal testosterone, right? I'm not making gains in that, but as soon as I come out to a normal range again, um, that's likely the answer to that, in my opinion.
So you're saying that it's not necessarily the increase in testosterone that's causing the muscle growth. It's the fact that the increase in testosterone is part of the process of the body essentially becoming healthier and working as it should. And as a result of that, that creates an anabolic environment that you wouldn't have if your body wasn't in the healthy place.
Yeah, yeah. That based off my sense of the literature and personal anecdote, right? Like I said, my bodybuilding, so N equals one experiment, if you will. That's where I would um, hedge my bets.
The point I'm going to make next is actually related to that, because what I was thinking was also, so we see this increase in testosterone in males with puberty and this increase in muscle mass, but also during puberty the body is growing, so your metabolism is faster than in adulthood because you're trying to grow into literally a bigger human. So I'm thinking, well, that's likely why we're seeing this increase in muscle mass together with the increase in testosterone, and it might not happen at any other point. For example, bodybuilder, you at the end of contest prep when you were thick skin lean, you probably didn't put on muscle at the same rate as an adolescent going through puberty, even though your testosterone was getting back into the normal
Mhm.
range.
Yeah, yeah, I would probably agree. Again, like when you are going through puberty, the increases in testosterone are so robust, right? Like you said, you're literally growing to become a male. Like, yeah, there's probably um again, that's kind of the whole idea is like you have, boys and girls, you go through puberty, and males, females, right? And so um now the whole saying like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like true to some extent, but again, in terms of like the adaptations to resistance training, we are humans and adapt in similar rates and stimuli for that matter.
I agree. A researcher on the differences in training adaptations between males and females that I interviewed a while ago also made a really interesting point, in my view, which is that typically, at least for people in our age range, Derek, it's much more likely that a male will start training earlier in life compared to a female. So this researcher made the point potentially what can also affect the absolute gains difference between males and females is that females start later, so they have less time to grow muscle if they
Hmm.
start lifting
Hmm.
later in life. And he was conducting some research where he noticed that, for example, in females the upper body was less developed than the lower body, and he postulated that it could be because most females enjoy and have a goal of training their lower body much more so than their upper body. So he thought even if they did start training earlier, perhaps they only focused on legs and didn't grow their upper body very much. So that's where the discrepancy is coming from.
Yeah, I mean
He
that's a
thought.
that's a good take, and yeah, we see that in the literature quite a bit, where females do differ from the upper body strength and recovery, and I see that in my coaching practice with the powerlifters that I work with. Um, like even on a relative basis, right? In regards to how much they can squat, bench press, and then or deadlift, and then what their bench press is compared to the male counterparts. Um, yeah, I think that is could certainly be a factor. The other thing is like that's probably one of the only sex differences on average. I would say is just like where we store that muscle mass. So yeah, you have the absolute muscle mass that's greater in males, and then it does seem that like you know we store body fat in different sections, right? So you have like the gynoid fat. Females store more visceral fat, of course, for reproductive purposes. But um, yeah, I think on average, like yeah, females have probably less musculature in the upper body, which is going to factor in. And like you mentioned, we see this with our study right now in the previous study, like anecdotally, like the most females, uh, people like to do stuff that we're good at, and on average, females because of the muscle mass tend to prefer the lower body movements because they're strong at them. And there's the vanity aspect that they want to train their glutes, right? Whereas you have guys who want to train their arms and the quote unquote t-shirt muscles, which is certainly the case. That certainly checks out with me. You know, uh, I I never had like large arms and shoulders as a kid and started lifting, but I was pretty good at squatting because I played hockey and had strong legs. So I tend to, and still like my favorite day is leg day. And when I go on stage as a bodybuilder, like the feedback was, oh my god, incredible quads. We got to bring up your arms, and that's because I'd always skip them. So now I have to like prioritize my arm training. So I realized I was a like long way kind of circling back to the point that, but yeah, it could be. Yeah, females don't get into it as early as males, and then they don't train that musculature certainly as much. Could be a factor for sure. I wouldn't disagree.
Yeah, it's interesting speculation anyway, but ultimately what's important is that within physiological ranges, these transient increases in these hormones are irrelevant to our purposes of growing muscle and improving strength. So now, since we are here at this point, I would cover the very last topic that I wanted to ask you about, if you're okay with that, Derek. I would like to talk about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is a very popular term in the research and in certain circles in the fitness community. So I want to hear from you what it is and how much we know about whether it takes place or whether it doesn't.
Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. All right. So yeah, in short of it, what it is essentially it's the um like non so if you think about muscle in cross section for a moment, right? So we have this long spaghetti noodle, and within that you have your myofibrils, which contain the sarcomeres, so the smallest uh, unit of muscle. If you think about it that way, right? So you have all these myofibers within um, or myofibrils within the cell, and so right away, about 80% of a myofiber is going to be the myofibrillar um, components, right? And what occupies that space is the sarcoplasm, right? So this is the um, you know non-contractile components. So you have things like fluid, um, other like non-functional proteins, but essentially what this is, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, is the disproportionate expansion of the sarcoplasm, right, relative to the myofibrillar protein accretion. And so this is the thought that you have um, essentially this robust increase in hypertrophy, but it's due to, like, conceivably it was thought like bodybuilders would do like training specific, like the higher volumes, high repetitions, lead to this expansion of the non-contractile or the sarcoplasm, which generating the gains. And this was the thought of like, oh, this is why bodybuilders aren't as strong as powerlifters, because they train with low repetitions. They don't have this increase in sarcoplasm, but they're substantially stronger. Um, that's and I can go on with that about strength being specific and powerlifters actually having a ton of muscle. But that really started with the idea was first kind of like discovered actually here McMaster with JD McDougall, and nobody really he used what's called TEM, or transmission electron microscopy, which is essentially a really crude way of assessing muscle fibers, but nobody really dove into that a little bit more. And then Cody Hahn is a great researcher and scientist from Mike Roberts' lab at Auburn, kind of aimed to investigate this and interrogate it a little bit more. And what it was essentially they did a volume study in a graded way. So basically, they started off the study giving, um, I think it was 10 weekly sets of quads, and then they got up to like 32 sets in the final week. So essentially, they had this trained individuals who were probably approaching like a ceiling, right? And then really drove up the volume. And so then what they did was they took the folks that had a higher response and kind of looked at it a little bit more individualized. So what I mean by that is they took um, the folks that quote unquote were high responders um, and biopsied them. Um, and it seemed like um, eight like after the training they saw more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as opposed to the myofibrillar components. Now, there is a few kind of limitations with that research, and I think the first one was like uh, the CSA data at the fiber level was not significant um, for that, and the concentrations of like their actin and myosin components were not as well. But they were very close, and that's one of the limitations with null hypothesis statistic testing. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But what I'm getting at is they're very close. So they did what's called a forced post hoc, and what they found was that the concentrations for both decreased by like about a third, or like around 30%. And so that's where this idea of like, oh, we have this non um, proportionate increase in hypertrophy, which is an actin and myosin. But when you actually um, like exclude some of that data, again, it was only 15 of the 31 that responded were higher responder. Um, so if you accept it at face value, you would say, oh yeah, this occurs. But again, what that mechanism is and the purpose and the impact of that process is remains um, to be seen. So uh, circling back uh, to the evidence to kind of refute that, we have substantial work, both in using tracer studies, follow up work from the Roberts Lab that used untrained folks. So there was some work done that Chris Mann had done, and they followed up there, and again, Brad Rupel as well. And essentially, what they found was like relatively um, similar, like proportionate increases in growth, like attributable to the actin and myosin components. So, um, when we think about it, there is like a possibility that if it does, it could be very transient and you know essentially backfilled with myofibrillar proteins because um, where we're at with that is if it's and we're thinking about the Han study, it's possible that if somebody becomes more trained, approaches the quote unquote ceiling, maybe sarcoplasmic hypertrophy kind of uses as more as like a scaffolding, or a primer for greater growth, to allow the cell to expand. But again, that's speculative. I think we kind of touched upon that in the review as well. Like perhaps anabolic use where you have this rapid, robust growth. Perhaps that's also facilitating the non or the disproportionate growth. Perhaps even creatine supplementation. At least the onset is it. Creatine stores water intracellular as well. So perhaps all of those can work to facilitate it. But I think the biggest thing is the Hornberger lab. So Troy Hornberger, one of the like most legendary muscle physiologists out there. So somebody who I have a tremendous amount of respect for him and their lab's work. They had a really nice breakthrough developing this imaging technique for visualizing the myofibrillars. So again, they used both rodent and human tissues, which is great. And basically, this imaging technique is quite robust and probably the best method we have to date. And essentially, what they found was that the radial growth, so if you think of it again, muscle in cross section of those myofibrillars are actually not increasing in size, but they're increasing in number. And so there's this kind of concept of myofibrillar genesis. And so these increases in the amount of myofibrils is what's driving the growth of muscle radially in cross section, which I think is fascinating. So Um, you know, it doesn't completely rule out sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, but it's quite compelling evidence, in my opinion, that the structural, adaptations associated with training is going to be largely due to the radial growth of myofibers, which is from the increase in myofibrils. And so, if sarcoplasmic hypertrophy does occur, it's going to be, in my opinion, um, small and not a huge uh, factor in long term hypertrophy.
That is fascinating for sure. And what that suggests to me in terms of practical application is that if somebody is trying to sell you, dear listener, a program for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy or a training technique to promote sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, they are reading research that neither I nor Derek have seen.
Yeah, and there's a study that I think should be retracted, or at least based off the title, from like Turkey. It's like sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy, and it's like they didn't even assess that. They just did like a high volume versus a low volume training, which I think is not appropriate based off the physiological um, techniques and rationale. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I think again, if we think about muscle and cross section, 80% of it is myofibrillar components, so the contractile units, and we see that after following periods of chronic training anyway. And so that's it. Now again, this isn't to it's more like I have a ton of appreciation for uh, the Roberts lab and the work that Cody Hahn did to really interrogate it, because if we don't move the field forward if we just accept things at face value. So that perhaps it does still happen. They have a great review paper proposing 3 conditions in which it does. And again, it's could be like they suggest a transient symptom of the training induced edema, so you have this swelling from higher muscle volumes that they were unaccustomed to. You could have a spatial priming for the muscle fibers, if you will. Or I think the last one's basically like well trained individuals reaching a ceiling, so this cell expands to kind of promote additional proteins. But again, all of that is secondary to the myofibrillar components. And like I said, I think Troy's work is the best model we have.
Thank you, Derek. You have been so exhaustive with your explanations and so generous with your time. We've been going on for 2 hours now and we've covered everything I would have wanted to ask you. So, in conclusion, let people know where they can connect with you and follow your work or contact you for coaching if you offer online coaching. And I'll put all of the links in the show notes.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I had a blast. And so yeah, like I said, I could talk about this for a lot longer. So I appreciate everybody that listened. If you have any questions or want to have some deep thoughts about skeletal muscle, just you can shoot me an email at Derrick at calgarybarbell.com. So that's Derrick DERRICK at calgarybarbell.com. Or I'm pretty active on Instagram, mostly things with my kids, lifting, a little bit of research, but not too much, to be honest. But I'm Derrick _ CBB. And again, you can email me. I do coach powerlifters through Calgary Barbell. I will be the first to tell you, while I finish my PhD, I kind of put that on hold. But fellow MNU nutritionist, so work with nutrition athletes as well. So that's a blast, and I have a lot of fun doing that. So if you're interested in that, reach out, and I'm happy to have a conversation. So thanks again.
Thank you, Derek. And yes, this is a perfect episode for uh, MNU alumni, since we both graduated from that excellent certification or course. And anyway, to wrap up, dear listeners, as always, thank you very much for being generous with your time and tuning into my podcast today. And I will talk to you next time.